Good morning. How you going? You may notice I'm not at church this morning. I'm here in Sandy Bay because I am preaching live at Wynyard. But it's great to have the chance to pre-record this sermon and continue our series on frameworks. I've been saying, and I really do believe this series is important because we're wrestling with what are the frameworks, the frameworks that come from the whole Bible that make sense of the whole of life. This is the third week. The first week we were looking at the fact that we were created to live in God's reality, but we chose our own reality. And so one of the challenges for all of us is we don't actually see what is real. What is real has to come to us from the outside. We don't see the world as it is, we see it as we are. And then last week we looked at this incredible truth that you are created in the image of God, and you are beautiful, but also you're broken. Now, with those two things in place, and just knowing that those two things are true, we then have to work out, so how can we know God? It's been Father's Day. One of the challenges for all of us is to come to terms with the place our dads had in our lives, because no matter who they weren't perfect, but they have had a profound shaping influence on us. And often the challenge is when we relate to or think about our dads, we are relating to the person who's in our head rather than the person who is actually the human being who was our dad. Similarly, I know for Leanne and I, our marriage is usually in the most trouble when I think I know Leanne, when I'm relating to the Leanne that's in my head rather than the person Leanne truly is, because Leanne is much more complicated than the outline I have in my head. Because of the two things we've talked about so far, when it comes to God, it can be a lot like that. We relate to the God who's in our head rather than the God who is actually there. And so we have to come to terms with who is God. There are kind of four approaches to God that have shaped us, and the first one is that often we see God as a projection, and apparently this is the default, that as you grow up, you develop an idea of the male adult figures in your life, and it is normal then to just project them onto God. So if your dad was a little bit of a hard person, someone that you were trying hard to please, then you'll often feel like God's a bit that way. Or if you had to work hard to get your dad's affection, you might think you've got to work hard to get God's affection. Or if your dad was a bit distant, you'll feel like God's a bit distant. And so it's normal to project your history onto God, and so when you use the word God, then that sort of gets all smushed together. Scientists talk about the God of the gaps, and what they mean by that is that through history, people have, when they haven't worked out how the sun rises or how things work, they may, it's fun having some dogs around. When the scientists have tried to work out, what makes a flower, or how the planets work, or then they've attributed the things they don't understand to God, and from a scientific point of view, there's been this sense that as we understand more and more, there's less and less space for God. Well, I think I'm going to demonstrate to you today that the God of the gaps isn't who God is. A couple of other things or ways we wrongly see God. One is that sometimes it's tempting to see God as your own personal genie, someone who you can turn to meet your ego needs. That's not God either. And another point of view is that God either doesn't matter, and so kind of like a watchmaker who created a watch and set it going. God created the world and got to set it going and then is off at a distance. They call that a deist point of view, or else that God doesn't exist. I'm going to hopefully show you from the Bible today why it's important to understand the God who does exist, because it helps you understand yourself and the world. But we need to be ready to receive the God who reveals himself to us, rather than just put our own understandings on top of God. To understand who God is, we need to turn to a bit of the Bible that many of us overlook. But it is actually, if you take the number of times the Bible itself refers to it, it's actually the most important part of the Bible. See, this part of the Bible is referred to about 120 times by other parts of the Bible. That's how important it is. But it is a bit that we often skip over. It is God's revelation of who he is, which is called in the Bible his glory. The word for glory in the Bible, it's a Hebrew word kabod, which means weight. It's the full weight of who God is. And so as God reveals himself, we find he's not really the God of the gaps. He's not your personal genie. He's not a projection of your history. And it does matter. We find this passage, that's referred to 120 times in the Bible, in Exodus chapter 34. Now, to understand it, it's important just to put it in a little bit of context. This is Moses leading the people out of Israel, and he'd had a bad day, to put it mildly. He had been up the mountain and had this incredible, literal mountaintop experience, received the 10 Commandments, and then gone back down and heard a party going on, and saw that Aaron had led the people astray and created an idol, and Moses gets so frustrated that he takes the 10 Commandments and smashes them on the ground, and he's got to go back up the mountain and ask for another copy, so to speak. And in doing that, he says to God, I just can't do this without you. And God says, okay, you don't have to. And Moses says, show me your glory. So that's Exodus 33. And it's like God says to him, yeah, okay, I don't know if you really know what you're asking, but what we'll do is we'll put you over there in this rock, and I'll pass in front of you. I'll tell you my name, and I'll let you see my glory. And so that's what we see in this passage, as I said, the passage that is related to more by the Bible than any other passage. It's referred to over 120 times. It is Exodus 34, verses 6 and 7. It says, the Lord passed in front of Moses, calling out, Yahweh the Lord, the God of compassion and mercy. I'm slow to anger and filled with unfailing love and faithfulness. I lavish unfailing love to 1,000 generations. I forgive iniquity, rebellion, and sin, but I don't excuse the guilty. I lay the sins of the parents upon their children and grandchildren. The entire family is affected, even children in the 3rd and 4th generations. Now you can kind of see, being Westerners, we like to boil things down to a simple point. One of the things you're told when you preach, you want a simple 3-point sermon with 3 key ideas. This is nothing like that. In fact, this is 13 core ideas. But what is it? Richard Borkham, who is a well-known theologian, says, Moses may not see who God is with his eyes, but he hears who God is. What he's saying is, this is who God is. And it's so important, isn't it? Because we've just been saying the last couple of weeks, you don't see the world as it is, and that there are a couple of parts to you, and you can't completely trust yourself. But here we have God coming from the outside and revealing who he is. And Richard Borkham says he hears from God himself, God's identity, his name, which is in the Hebrew just 4 letters, YHWH, which we've come to pronounce as Yahweh. And in the Greek version and in the New Testament, it gets rendered as the Lord. And it's his name and his character. As Israel so much needs to know, Borkham says, Moses hears that God is merciful, compassionate, forgiving, and faithful to his covenant promises. The story seems to suggest that God's glory is the radiance of his character, goodness, and who he truly is. So I think one of the really important things for us to be doing is to get a realistic view of who God actually is and let him come from the outside to us. And that's what he does in this passage, and that's why this passage is referred to over and over and over again, except by us Western Christians who find it a bit, hard to fit in our heads. So what is it? As we've said, it's who God is, and it starts with God's name, Yahweh. And it's important to understand this is a personal name. It's a name of a person. But also for Hebrew people, the name carries great meaning. It's not just, this is what I feel like naming someone. It's the name captures the character of a person. And so what name does God choose for himself? Most Bible scholars understand the name Yahweh to mean the one who exists or the one who causes existence. So right there, we need to stop and just think, okay, well, look at all this. God's name tells us he is the one that causes all this to come into existence. This is who God is. And then we see this description of his character or what he cares about. And often this is where we fall into trap with our dads, or I fall into trap with Leanne, where when you're relating to the person who's in your head, you lose touch with what their character really is. You relate to the story that's in your head, and often great harm has been done when they're relating to the God, when we are relating to the God who's in our heads rather than who God really is. And as we see God reveal his character, we actually see almost 2 sides to it. We see that the whole description of himself is about relationship. It's all about relationship. The first half is kind of just beautiful. The compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Isn't that beautiful? And there's this sense of grace, of mercy, of God's compassion in that. I love that. But then we get this other side that comes through. Yet he doesn't leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sins of the parents to the 3rd and 4th generation. And so we see in God revealing himself both this beautiful revelation of grace and love and mercy, but also this revelation of justice and boundaries and consequences, both of which are God. Now, one of the things we talked about last week is we as human beings are created in the image of God. And so what that tells us is if we're created in the image of this God, then we need to be paying attention to this, because there'll be something deep in us that comes alive when we're in the presence of mercy, compassion, and grace, but also cares deeply about justice and consequences and rightness and fairness. Isn't that true? This is who we are, but it's also who God is, and this God created this world. And so this is why I agree with James Anthony Froude. He says, one lesson, and only one, history may be said to repeat with distinctness, that this world is built somehow on moral foundations, that in the long run it is well with the good, in the long run it is ill with the wicked. But this is no science, it's no more than the old doctrine taught long ago by the Hebrew prophets. That what we see here in God's revelation of who he is are the moral foundations that the world is built on. Cecil B. DeMille, who filmed the movie The Ten Commandments, said something really interesting. He said, we cannot break the Ten Commandments. We can only break ourselves against them. What he's saying is, you can choose, if you like, to ignore how God made the world, to ignore the moral framework behind who God is and behind who the world is and behind how you were created. But by ignoring it doesn't mean it goes away. What actually happens, and test this in your own life, when you step across a boundary, it causes pain, it causes damage. And so what you would expect to see, if this is true, what you would expect to see is that in a world where the boundaries go missing, people are becoming more and more damaged. And so as you look around the world at the moment, it does ring true, doesn't it? And it's not only just about the boundaries, it's about care. Mother Teresa said, if we have no peace, it's because we've forgotten that we belong to each other. That God here reveals himself to be ultimately relational. And we are built to care about relationship. And so this is the God who reveals himself to Moses. And what's Moses' response to that? Moses immediately threw himself to the ground and worshipped. And he said, oh Lord, if it's true that I've found favour with you, then please travel with us. Yes, this is a stubborn and rebellious people, but please forgive our iniquity and sins. Claim us as your special possession. That as Moses sees who God really is, he worships and goes, yeah, this is what we want. This is who we want. And I think as we let ourselves see who God is, I bet you there's something deep in you that goes, oh yeah, this is right. Both mercy and justice are the foundations that the world's built on, but are also the foundations you're built on. And the idea that this personal God, this loving God wants relationship. Don't you find yourself responding to that? This isn't a God of the gaps. This isn't a genie. This isn't a projection. And this God really matters, because as you understand him, you'll understand what makes a healthy family, what makes a healthy community, what makes our world what our world is. And it's serious. As we look around our world, we can see just clearly that there is injustice everywhere you look. Over my shoulder, West Point Casino is owned by a family who own the majority of poker machines in the state, and in July only, I can't believe it, but we lost, in just the month of July in Tasmania, $18 million was taken out of the pockets of the families who can least afford it and put it in the pockets of the family that own the casino. That's just one example. Everywhere we look, there is injustice, and there is also a lack of grace, a lack of mercy. I love the picture of compassion and grace we see in who God is. There's a picture of getting inside what life is like for another person. And too often, rather than getting inside what life is like for another person, we distance ourselves from each other. We miss this bit of the Bible because it's not neat and tidy. It's not something that's easily memorable. But for Jewish people, they call this part of the Bible the 13 attributes, and it's right at the centre of their holiest day of the year, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, but it's also at the centre of all their thinking about right and wrong. One rabbi, Josh Jacobs, Veld Essential, said, "I can guarantee you, God willing, when folks find Jews on this earth 500 years, we'll still be chanting the 13 attributes." For Jewish people, this bit of the Bible is central. And as we let God come to us from the outside and try and capture and understand who he actually is, we start to see that a lot of the rest of the Bible makes sense, but also we're called to think differently about the world we're in. Zechariah says, "This is what the Lord Almighty says, administer true justice, show mercy and compassion to one another." Did you get that? So the two sides, the justice and the mercy and the compassion. And then he goes straight on and says this: "Don't oppress the widow or the fatherless, the foreigner or the poor. Don't plot evil against each other." Why does he go straight from justice, mercy and compassion to the widow, the fatherless, the foreigner or the poor? Well, it's fairly simple at one level, and it's a theme right the way through the Bible. We see in Exodus 22, Deuteronomy 10, 14, 24, 20, a couple of times in 24, 26, 27, Psalm 68, 146, Isaiah 1, 10, 1 and 10, Jeremiah 7 and 22, Ezekiel 22 and Malachi 3, 5. In all these places, the prophets come and ask about these same groups of people. Why? Because they are the least influential people in any society. And the measure of justice and mercy, of grace and truth, of the boundaries being held up and people being seen and valued is not how the most influential people are going, it's how the least influential people are going. And so those without money, the single mums, the refugees, the homeless kids, they're the ones that measure the glory of God, the character of God, and whether we're being true to the image of God. And you'd have to say, after seeing what was happening on our TV over the weekend and seeing some of the stuff that's happened in our community and some of the challenges we are facing, we've probably got a bit of work to do, wouldn't you say? I think we need to heed the promise. You see, we live in a capitalist economy where the measure of your value is measured in dollars and cents. And the rich are getting richer at the expense of the poor, and often in abusive ways. And the book of Habakkuk speaks directly to that. And it also promises that God's glory will ultimately show up in the context of an abusive society. Listen to this. "What sorrow awaits you who build big houses with money gained dishonestly. You believe your wealth will buy security, putting your family's nest beyond the reach of danger. But by the murders you committed, you've shamed your name and forfeited your lives. The very stones in the walls cry out against you, and the beams in the ceilings echo the complaint. What sorrow awaits you who built cities with money gained through murder and corruption. Has not the Lord of heaven's armies promised that the wealth of nations will turn to ashes? They worked so hard, but all in vain." And listen to this. "For as the waters fill the sea, the earth will be filled with the awareness of the glory of the Lord." That ultimately, justice and mercy and compassion will prevail. The boundaries will be restored. People will be seen and valued. This earth will become aware of the beautiful nature of who God really is. this awareness of the glory of God is actually meant to set our agenda. The Westminster Shorter Catechism says man's chief end is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. Theologian Richard Mellick Jr. says those who understand God's glory by faith are called to act according to what they have seen. They represent God's glory on earth, listen to this, by the values they hold as well as by their actions. We're called not just to have an intellectual understanding of God, we are called to represent God. We're called to represent this God who's not a figment of our imagination, but this God who comes from the outside, this God of compassionate love and true justice. And this is what God's heart always was. Adam and Eve were meant to be his representations. We were meant to be his representations, and then he chooses a people, the people of Israel, not to be, a special little club, but to come and represent him to the rest of the world. Kind of the two founding documents of Israel make this clear. The Genesis 12 says, this is the commission to Abraham. He says, leave your native country, your relatives and your father's family, and go to the land that I'll show you. I'll make you into a great nation. I'll bless you and make you famous, and you will be a blessing to others. I'll bless those who bless you and curse those who treat you with contempt. And all the families on the earth will be blessed through you. So what is the purpose for Israel? To be a blessing to everybody else. They're not here to be the center of attention. They are to be here for the rest of the world. And then this other founding document, which is takes that the next step, is this God's word to Moses in Exodus 19. And he says to the people of Israel, now if you obey me and keep my covenant, you will be my own special treasure from among the peoples on the earth, for all the earth belongs to me. And what will be their purpose? You will be my kingdom of priests, my holy nation. This is the message you must give to the people of Israel. What does it mean to be a kingdom of priests? Well, a kingdom obviously is a place where the king's in charge, but the task of a priest is to represent God to the people and the people to God. And so the purpose of Israel was to be this nation that represents God to the people of the world. And we see, as you catch a glimpse of the Old Testament, you see that in their own strength, and as because of all the stuff we were talking about last week, in our own strength, we just can't do that. But as you get onto this, I hope other verses in the Bible start to make a bit more sense, because we use the word glory in terms of, shining lights or adulation, that kind of thing. That's not the biblical understanding of what glory is. Glory is the very nature of who God is. And as you get onto that, then verses like, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, make sense. If glory was a shining light or adulation, that doesn't make sense. But all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Okay, yeah. And I think we can acknowledge, can't we? It's true for us. We do not have, I don't have in my strength, what I need to be perfectly just and full of grace. I can't do that. And neither can you. But as you get onto the Bible, you start to see, okay, this is still the promise. That's fine. Nice having some dogs around here. So John 15:8, this is to my Father's glory, that you bear much fruit, showing yourself to be my disciples. This is to my Father's glory, that people see in your lives the fruit of the Spirit, which produces, if you look at the fruit of the Spirit, what does it do? It produces justice, mercy and compassion. It produces grace and truth. It produces the nature of God in time and space. Romans 5, we rejoice or boast in the hope of the glory of God. Not only so, we glory in our sufferings, because our sufferings produce the kind of character that enables us to live the glory of God. 1 Corinthians 10, whether you eat or drink, whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. Are you seeing it? Can you see how this incredible truth is that God comes from the outside, wants relationship, but who he is a little inconvenient. There's two sides to who he is that is continually calling us out. The calling us out to be the kind of people who are merciful and loving, but also stand for boundaries. So what does all this mean? What does it mean for us to put this glory of God understanding as a framework in our actual lives? Well, it means starting to realise the God that's in your head may not be exactly who God is. God is bigger, but he's a God of love, but he's also profoundly a God of boundaries. And there is a tempting part of us wanting to reach for a simplistic faith, a faith that is just built around us, a God that doesn't have boundaries. Dietrich Bonhoeffer called that a cheap grace. He said that there's this tempting part of all of us that wants a God that leads us to preach forgiveness without requiring repentance, to have baptism without having church discipline, to have communion without confession, absolution without personal confession. Cheap grace, he says, is grace without discipleship, grace without the cross, grace without Jesus Christ living and incarnate. God's glory calls us, who he really is calls us to be agents of his justice and love, to get beyond ourselves. Now, because of everything we spoke about last week, we know that we're not going to be able to perfectly do it. The hope of us glorifying God isn't in us. I am so grateful for Colossians 1:27, which sort of encapsulates it beautifully. It says, to them, God has chosen to make known among the Gentiles the glorious riches of this mystery. And what's the mystery? It's Christ in you, the hope of glory. This morning, the news is this, that this world is built on moral foundations. There is a framework that helps you come alive, that within the framework of justice and mercy, isn't it true? You're able to be more yourself. That one of the dangers can be that when we lose ourselves, when the boundaries go missing, or when we're not being seen and valued. But what we see in the glory of God is the framework where we can be ourselves. And the truth is, as we're saying, is we can't pull that off by ourselves. We need Jesus. It's Christ in us, the hope of glory. So as we come to bring all this together, I want to remind us of the verse from Micah. It says this, people, God's told you what's good. Micah 6:8 this is, and this is what he requires of you. To do what is right, to do what is just and merciful, to do what is truth and grace, to keep the boundaries firm, but make sure you're loving. That's what is right. To love mercy and to walk humbly with our God. To know you don't have all the answers. God is the foundation of this world. He is a foundation of justice and mercy, a foundation of grace and truth. And we are called to be open to this God, to move beyond the pictures we have in our head and be open ourselves and realize as we open ourselves to the God who is really there, the God who is justice and mercy, we find that the fabric of the universe makes sense. And you find that all the places where your family is broken are the places where justice has gone missing or the grace has gone missing. This is how the world actually works. This is why understanding who God is so important. And we have to face the parts of us that want to look away. that want to look away from injustice, want to look away from a lack of mercy. We're called to be agents of his love and truth, of his grace, mercy and justice. And so this morning I just want to ask you, are you willing? Are you willing to put your agenda aside and open yourself to his agenda? Are you willing to let the God of glory be your God? In just a minute, the band are going to play and Dan will lead you in prayer. But can I encourage you? Look to who God actually is, and you'll find he's beautiful. God's glory, his justice and his mercy, his truth and his grace is the framework within which the whole world makes sense. And it's a framework that too often goes missing for us.